How did I get here again? Said no one who was asleep behind the wheel of their avatar, of their human form, driving their day to day existence, blithely unaware, unassuming, and uncaring about the internal mechanisms which would ultimately drive their external world. And yet, there's a group of others who are awake or awakening, who start to understand that there's something inside of them. There's a theme or a pattern, consistent elements throughout their life and their years, which is ironically shared. How did I end up here again? They said. Our life and the circumstances surrounding the elements therein are like concentric circles. When we realize that the pattern is inside of us, we start to see that our relationships are the puzzle, the manifested puzzle for which we can navigate that pattern. It's right there in front of our eyes every single day, like Chinese finger trap, or like one of those ball mazes where you're the ball and you're in this box and you're cruising through the different corridors. These are the decisions that you make that lead to certain outcomes. And you're trying to navigate past the holes where that little marble will fall through. And your awareness and your consciousness is like navigating and tilting that box through your decisions and guiding that ball. And at some point, your level of awareness shifts from the position of being the ball, just bumping up against things, not quite sure where you're going, to the hands that are guiding and tilting the box through your willpower, your understanding, your dedication to your personal journey, whatever that might be. Then to the person who has eyes that is observing the box and holding the box and watching the marble. That marble is like you in your everyday reality, in your avatar, in your physical form. The conscious observer is beyond that, where you're seeing a different world imposed on the one that you thought you existed in. It is seeing the concentric circles around you like a decision tree spiraling inwards or outwards. And as you're traversing a particular lifeline, going in a particular outcome and a direction, you're faced with creation itself, which is confronting you head on. When we are unawake, unconscious, there are many ways to describe it, we're largely unaware of this perspective shift. And in fact, we often feel, rightfully so, because we just don't have that deepened sense of beyond the present moment, the things that have happened to us. And as a result, we succumb at that position of consciousness to this idea that everything is a result of everybody else. All of the hardships, all of the brute force reality checks are not a result of anything that we have done per se. Sometimes we might take a little responsibility here and there when it's apparent and it's obvious. And we definitely like to take credit for the good things that happen. But even then, sometimes we believe that it's just luck. And until we see the bigger picture, until we awaken to that perspective beyond to the person that's holding the box, the nesting doll arrangement is another way that I talk about it in the past. Different positions and orientations of consciousness as you are in your physical form. You actually have different seats of awareness where you can watch yourself from different levels. And until that develops, the contiguous view that we have is input to output, to eyes, to brain, to hands, to body. And there's nothing above or below or expanded past. It's just we're looking out of our eyes. That's all that there is, clearly, because that's all I can see. I'd raise your hand if you've ever had that perspective. I have, especially when I was an atheist scientist. So as a result, we believe that the outside world is separate from consciousness, separate from this higher order function that we might even have a sense of if we're not completely cold-hearted, materialist reductionists. We might even get a glimpse of if we happen to be religious or spiritual. But until we've experienced it, that expansion, it's hard to really wrap our minds around it. So as a result, when we are indoctrinated and bred in things like consumerism and values of materialism, there's nothing wrong with that. But when that's all that we've ever known, we don't spend time developing necessarily ourselves at that higher octave awareness or that expanded perspective. And so as a result, when people talk about the nature of reality or manifestation coming from that position of consciousness, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't compute. So it's easy to discard, to push away. But when somebody starts to awaken and they start to ask questions about their life and the structure of the matrix and beyond, they start to realize that there are themes and patterns which hold us together. Why is it, for example, that we're always fighting an oppressor? We take care of one, and then we're on to the next, almost as though the cycle never really ends. Why is there always a slaver? This is at a macro level, of course, but at an individual level, we often fight with the man, whoever the man is at any given point, the woman, the other, the them. There's always something, right? Which, if you just look at the materialization, we can get fixated on the details. What's so and so? Well, sure, for this lifetime, for this year, for this decade, and then it's somebody else. How did we end up here again? When we see the loops of our lives, especially at an individual level, we start to understand that there's a common thread between our relationship failures. For those that have had failures, not everybody does. And we start to understand that the challenges in those dynamics in the workplace, business partnerships, spouses, families, they seem to follow us even if we move, even if we move halfway across the world in a different culture. It's actually kind of magical when you think about it. Like, how could it be that you could just naturally attract the right set of circumstances or people to challenge you in such a way to illuminate these patterns and these blind spots, almost as though the entire matrix itself is a puzzle, an escape room, if you will, at all levels, the individual and the collective level. And perhaps that's what they actually mean by ascension, transcendence, rising above our former patterns, prisons and cages, and the things that have locked us in to repetitive cycles. It's funny, I work a lot with people in relationships, all sorts, long-term marriages, people that have been perpetually single, people that are on their third marriage, people that are in soul contracts, in love with twin flame, but married to somebody else. Many, many, many different flavors. People who are single, who have never been married. People who are in love with somebody who's in love with somebody else. And what I observe is that there's always a common theme that traverses like a thread through somebody's life. That all it has to do is be tugged on a little bit, and the right questions asked to click certain pieces of awareness into place to allow for the mind to integrate a different level of information and understanding, which can bring about closure, peace, and understanding, as I mentioned, or forgiveness. And often it helps people to resolve wounds that have been active for almost their entire lives just by talking about it and then deciding to do something differently. The awareness is the first step. The understanding helps to bring about emotional resolution. But then deciding to integrate that knowledge and to rise above that wound or that challenge, especially when you can shift the perspective and understand why the betrayal is there, why the hurt is there, and then to see it without the hurt from somebody else's view who wasn't necessarily trying to be a villain, but was held captive to their own patterns and victim to their own prisons. And when you can successfully do that, something magical happens, that the image people held in their minds of the other, the fearsome other, the one that should be hated, the one that, and that's pretty harsh. I don't always work with people that hate others. The one that should be retaliated against, one that should be continuously disappointed, the one that you fill in the blank. When you move past those feelings, what you find is a renewed sense of humanity, togetherness, and resolution. And you start to see even the worst, quote, enemy as somebody who was doing the best that they could. That doesn't mean that the best that they could was good enough for you at that time. But you start to unpack and unwind truly what it was like in that state of consciousness or awareness when somebody was helpless to their own issues and acting out because of those. And it helps you to step in the position of victor as opposed to victim. It more readily solidifies the path to liberation. And then when you combine that understanding and that forgiveness, which often comes with a shift in identity, so you no longer resonate with what happened to you, whatever it was. And you start to mature from it. And you heal, self-heal that wound. You give yourself closure. What happens is that you start to edify this persona that you're different. And you're no longer impacted and affected in the same way that you were. And all of a sudden, that circle that you were walking on opens up. That marble that would have fallen through the hole again, you'd have to roll it all the way back to the beginning to start all over. It passes through into a different part of the maze. And the pattern isn't completely solved, I find. There are levels and tiers of it. So you have to actually go through a couple of iterations. And it seems like the universe will bring you, or yourself, will bring you challenges and opportunities to see if you're really going to be triggered in the same way and if you're really dedicated to this new level of transformation. And the key is not to be perfect. You don't have to be perfect. You can actually still have the same emotional map that you've been carrying for a while, and people often do. It helps to tinker and upgrade it along the way, but you have to do so from a very, very high position of awareness and understanding sensory information as inputs. So when you see and interpret somebody doing something to you that gets an emotional reaction out of you, you start watching that in real time from above, from the person that's holding the box, not as the marble. You used to be the marble, but now you're holding the box, watching the marble. You see it, you feel it, you allow it, but then you actually walk back in your mind and you don't allow it to control your reaction anymore, ideally. But for some people, it takes a little bit of practice to get there. And so what happens is that it does control your reaction because it's a deeply ingrained knee-jerk response. That's what keeps you in the circle. That's what keeps you in the pattern. But then you self-correct. And the time, the delta that it takes for you to self-correct from when you lashed out or acted out or got back in the pattern to your self-correction, that delta is going to get smaller and smaller and smaller the more you progress out of the pattern. The more you start to actually transcend, that time shortens. And then you get to real time, where you're seeing everything from that very high vantage point. You're watching you, not through your eyes, but kind of above your head a little bit. You're still in your body, but you have just like a couple of millimeters of distance. And you're watching the world come at you with the same BS that's always gotten you before. The same thing that would have tripped you up, that would have caused you to do X again. Now, in the moment, you're like, I see it. I am not going to let that happen. I'm committed to my path of transformation. You allow the feelings, but you stop behavior. And that, over repeated successions, gives you the sense of, I've changed. The emotions are still there, but they no longer control you. And then what happens is that when you have a little bit of confidence in that self-mastery, this is the self-mastery process, and you start to see everything play out, then the emotions lose their charge. Then the stimuli that you used to be very, very triggered by, especially if you can understand it from that other person's perspective, as they're caught in their own shadow pattern, and you can see them caught in their own prison, you no longer take it personally because you have this higher level understanding and compassion. And then what happens is really interesting. Then you get so much distance from your old interpretation of their behavior or whatever circumstance used to bother you in that pattern. You get so much emotional distance that it becomes neutral. It's not positive, it's not negative, it has no charge. It does not affect you anymore. That's when you can really start breaking cycles because you're no longer caught in any sort of pattern or program. That's how you move from the paradigms which used to bind you. And you do so first by that awareness and that installation of different, I call it stop functions. You literally have to catch things like a chain of events, from stimuli to emotional reaction to behavior. You have to break everything out in your perceptual awareness. That requires a lot of energy and a lot of attention. That's where a lot of people are not dedicated to actually changing, which is why you can't be asleep behind your wheel and your avatar and change out of your patterns, your relationships, your prisons, the things that used to bind you. It requires an investment, time, energy, and sometimes money if you work with a coach like myself. But that is a foolproof method of breaking the cycles that have bound you in your life.